When you think of a prairie, what states come to mind? Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas? How about Michigan? It's hard to picture today, but prairies once flourished here when Michigan was unsettled, and some remnants still survive. When you think of ecosystems in Michigan, you usually think of forests or wetlands, but they are only part of the area's natural legacy.
In Michigan, it wasn't all trees. We hear the term oak openings, oakland, Bloomfield was a typical name reflecting the prairie vegetation. So there were small areas of grassland that occurred naturally in the state which we think of as being a timbered state.
We have prairie plants along the entire part of the Oakland Township section of the Paint Creek Trailway.
This plant community has been here since the time of the Native Americans. Because this is such a high quality system, we think actually that it's received very little human impact over time.
Whereas this particular remnant has a lot of big blue stem and very tall grasses, other areas of the trailway will have different types of prairie plants like showy goldenrod or stiff goldenrod or blazing star, all different other types of prairie plants. And I really hope that people get out and explore the entire 5 miles and familiarize themselves with the other plants and enjoy them too.
The word prairie is a French word for meadow. There was a time when 40% of the United States was covered with prairie lands. To the untrained eye, a prairie can look like a simple field of weeds. But a prairie is actually a complex ecosystem of long-rooted plants and grasses that provide shelter and food for insects and wildlife. Prairie plants are resilient and hardy, able to stand up to harsh natural conditions. But as the country was settled, they proved no match for the plow.
Grasslands were easy to plow and turn into cultivated ground. You didn't have to cut down trees. The deep roots of the prairie grasses were a challenge to the plows, and steel sod-breaking plow was a great invention in that regard. A lot of prairies seem to maintain themselves naturally as open ground. In prehistorical times, fire encouraged that.
We tend to think of fire as a means of destroying life, but fire actually helps prairie plants live and thrive.
Probably originally, before the railroads, natural lightning would have occasionally burned this site off and maintained it as a prairie in that fashion. I'm guessing that, and I think history would indicate that Native Americans probably burned this site to keep it as a prairie because it had value to them for hunting and possibly for food, but especially for hunting, which was their food. Later on, when the railroads came through, we know from the old railroads that they created a lot of fires. And so this prairie was managed in that fashion.
Most trees and shrubs are not adapted to fire at all. In fact, the fire will quickly kill the trees and shrubs and their root systems. However, a lot of the species found in prairies actually require fire to continue their existence. They are adapted to being burned continually.
Native prairie plants typically have very deep rootstocks and low-growing rosettes of leaves which are very close to the ground. As the fire sweeps across an area, it is moving fast, too fast to burn very hot in any one place. The prairie rootstocks are generally unaffected, while encroaching shrubs and trees are killed.
Whereas the fire will quickly take care of what is above ground, the root systems are so well adapted to surviving the heat, they'll quickly come back and reestablish after the fire is done.
The seeds of prairie plants are also often adapted so that actually the seeds are encouraged to open by the effect of the heat of a fire. So after the fire is done, the ground has been cleared of all other competing plants, and those seeds have the ready access to the sunlight, and they're ready to grow.
Prairie grasses are very interesting because what scientists have found is that the seeds will remain in the soil for a very long time. I've heard 50 years, 100 years, just laying there dormant. And then all of a sudden, when the right conditions occur, which in many cases is when there's a prescribed burn, that will cause the seeds to germinate and come back.
When my family first moved into this area, the train was still operating, and it was a regular thing on a warm fall day to hear the fire engines, sirens going to try to put the fires out along the railroad.
The railroad helped the community grow and change from rural to urban. As it did, some prairie parcels were lost, while others along the tracks were preserved. The first passenger train arrived in Rochester in 1872 and was acquired by the Michigan Central Railroad in 1881. In 1930, the Michigan Central was leased by New York Central, who continued operations until the 1960s. Railroad operations began to decline after the Second World War as the national highway system and air travel began to take over. In 1964, the last passenger line ceased operations. In 1968, the New York Central merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, forming Penn Central. But this measure only delayed the inevitable, and the company fell into bankruptcy a few years later. At the same time, many concerned residents saw their community grow at a rapid rate. They sought to protect and preserve a part of the area's natural heritage, and turning the obsolete rail easements into a series of hiking and biking trails was a good way to do it.
A recent study shows that property values adjacent to parks and trails is a linear park can increase as much as 20%. And that then puts more money back into the city coffers to do other things, to provide other services and provide other recreational services or quality of life type services.
The idea for the Paint Creek Trailways Commission was an outgrowth of about a decade of community effort in this Rochester Hills, Oakland Township area towards getting in bike paths, a bike path system that would be used for recreation and for actual transportation purposes. And one of the parts of that thinking was that the Paint Creek Trail could be part of a whole general community bike and hiking system.
Well, it was actually in the late 1960s that a citizens group formed here in Oakland Township. We saw the very rapid development that was beginning to move across then Avon Township, now Rochester Hills, the next jurisdiction to the south, and we said, wow, you know, 5 years from now this is going to be hitting us. So we got interested in land use, and we read a book that's become a Bible for landscape architects and developers, Ian McHarg's Design with Nature. And we used that as a guide and said, we want to develop land use plans here in Oakland Township, which will try to steer development away from the significant natural areas and towards those open, high, dry farm fields, which would be most suitable to development with the least adverse impacts.
Certainly in other states in the country, there had been rails to trails conversions. And also there had been local community hiking, biking, horsebacking networks all over the country. One of the states that had a pioneer rails to trails set of projects was Wisconsin. And in the early stages of thinking about converting this Penn Central Railroad to a trail, I did confer quite a bit with people managing trails in Wisconsin.
It was 1974 that, that we convened the first meeting with people from the state DNR and some Oakland County folks and local folks, and just started saying, look, we know this right-of-way is abandoned. It's a principal feature in the landscape through the communities here along Paint Creek, and let's start getting a strategy in order to hopefully obtain public ownership of it.
With the trailways secure, work began immediately to enhance the trail experience. The Prairie Restoration is one of many projects designed to encourage people to visit the area.
One of the things that we've always emphasized with the Paint Creek Trail is that there are opportunities to, I always call them side parcels, to work with landowners and perhaps create some bulges along the trail, both for appreciation of the special natural resources and a few places where it would just be nice to have a little picnic ground for people to stop and have a picnic.
And we drew up a strategic plan for arts and cultural projects on the trail, and determined that we would like to have a project in each one of our 4 communities. And this is our first one. This one on the prairie and the prairie management, the prairie restoration, is in Oakland Township.
The side parcel containing this prairie remnant was donated by a local resident.
Since we live just a half a mile south of here, I was acquainted with a neighbor of ours, the Ray Nicholson and Mary, whose house is just across the creek from here on Livernois, and this was part of their parcel of property.
Ray Nicholson has been a successful restaurant operator in other communities in southeast Michigan. When he became the owner of the Paint Creek Restaurant in Goodison, things began to come together.
They were very generously made a donation of the land to the Trailway Commission, and so it'll remain a wonderful side parcel where trailway users can wander off on a trail and get to enjoy the special plants that are in this area.
Once the prairie parcel was identified and secured, consultant ecologists were brought in to develop a plan to restore this unique prairie remnant to a more biologically diverse state.
Right now, we have high quality, very small prairie that's being impacted by shade from other plants that are moving into the system. And so the goal is really to restore it to be a classic prairie ecosystem.
As you can see, this prairie remnant is dominated by big bluestem, which is one of our lovely Michigan native prairie grasses. And it'll be interesting to see what other species we might be able to encourage.
The process began in the spring of 2001 with a thorough analysis of the site, taking an inventory of the types of plants that are contained in the parcel. Quadrants are used to evaluate the present site and see the effect of future preservation efforts.
The quadrants are for sampling the vegetation, identifying it within a 1 meter square area, and being able to go back to the exact same point year after year and monitor what's in that particular location, down to the level of the sampling frame always goes with the post in the southeast corner of the sampling frame, so that we can be assured that as long as nobody sneaks out here in the middle of the night and moves our posts, we're going back to the exact same location, and we can be confident that what we're actually observing is changes over time.
Years of fire suppression in the area allowed shrubs, trees, and other non-prairie species to encroach and endanger the native prairie vegetation. During the winter months of 2002, many of these trees and plants were removed to allow the traditional prairie species to flourish. As restoration and maintenance continues, the rewards become more evident.
The Paint Creek Trail is absolutely one of our jewels. It's a wonderful place for not only for people to get together and exercise. It's a little blast from the past, I think. When you walk by, you can almost visualize how it used to be. And I think that's what's so exciting about this Prairie Restoration project is this is a wonderful opportunity to rejuvenate a little piece of our past and also to educate people about what we really have lost through development and just the changing lifestyle.
I think that this is just a remarkable chance to restore a small piece of prairie that will give people a glimpse into the nation's past, the nation's history, and a glimpse into an ecosystem that most people don't know much about.
This site had caught people's attention for a long time because of one of the types of plants that it has. The blue lupins that are a native prairie plant, and at that time this site did not have as many trees, which have grown in since the origin of the trail. And the blue lupins would really catch people's eyes as they would come along the trail. People knew about it. This is one of the types of prairies that is along the trail. There are two other major types as well. We're finding out more and more about the numbers of prairies that do exist along this trail.
It just strengthens that whole experience of being out on the trail. You get to learn a little bit about your history, learn a little bit about plants and wildlife, and get some good exercise while you're doing it, and actually some recreation time with your family.
I think we probably have a basic human instinct of connection with the outdoors. If it's planting petunias or going for a walk in the woods or whatever, that's something very basic in us.
People aren't the only ones who are benefiting from prairie restoration efforts. A variety of wildlife depends on this type of ecosystem for survival.
My guess is that as we improve the prairie and increase the prairie species here, actually the wildlife population will probably increase because they like the prairies and the prairie plants. It starts with bird life. The prairie sites have a lot of insects, and insects feed a lot of birds. Then there are animals that are predators to the birds that will be here to try to capture the birds, and so on it goes.
Sometimes when you have a particular species of plant, you also have other animals that are associated with it. That's particularly the case with insects, and this site is really unique in the amount of wild lupin that it has. Wild lupin is a food plant for several threatened and endangered species of butterfly. One of which is the Carner blue, which is a threatened species. The frosted elfin also eats lupin. And while we don't expect, based on the location, those butterflies to exist here right now, the potential for having a habitat for those species in the future is there.
Wildlife biologists these days are saying we used to acquire a lot of wildlife preserve areas, but they were patches of land. And nowadays, a lot of the emphasis is on we need corridors, because wildlife needs to be able to move from one place to another. And when you confine wildlife in just a small patch someplace, the genetic pool gets deteriorated, just all kinds of biodiversity gets lost.
The Paint Creek Trail and the adjacent prairie parcel are intertwined. Together, they help tell of the area's history, a story that begins with early settlers and continues with present-day cooperation and generosity between neighbors and local governments.
Trails play a very important part in providing what we call our probably backyard recreation. Something that people can go out their back door and get on a trail and bike, hike, ride horses, cross-country ski in the wintertime.
One hopes it will be a very long-lasting part of the community. It's certainly well supported by the residents and their governments.
Acquiring land and preserving it in its natural condition, I think, is one of the things you can expect to come back 50 and 100 years later and say, you know, we did a good thing when we did that.